Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight for the webinar. I'm Josh White. I lead the Producer Education and Sustainability team here at National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and we're glad you chose to spend some time with us tonight. Some of our presenters were just commenting that they have some rough weather coming through the southeast, so hopefully you're safe and sound and get some needed moisture, but not a storm tonight. We're proud to be partnering on this grazing and forage series here with several fine land-grant universities and experts and producers from across the country, outstanding stewards of land and forage, and great cattle producers as well. And we've also got some great sponsors who are committed to bringing solutions for cattle producers every day that are going to be contributing to the conversation as well. As a participant, your line is muted tonight because we have several hundred folks joining us. So feel free to type in any questions in the question box on your screen, and I'll moderate those questions out to the presenters at the very end after we've heard from all three. If you have any trouble with your technology, if you're in one of those stormy areas and your power goes out or something, we are recording this, so we'll send a link out to all those that registered, hopefully tomorrow, to be able to view those up on YouTube. And of course, you can always go to our website, ncba.org, click on the producer tab, and then just look for the webinar tab under that to get the latest information about current and upcoming webinars, as well as get to those past recordings. So again, the webinar tonight is featuring three great speakers. It's titled Grazing Systems and Management. We've got Grant Breitkreitz, who's the co-owner of Stony Creek Farm up in Redwood Falls, Minnesota. Stony Creek is a cow-calf operations forage-based, but also they balance the forages with crop production. And Grant was telling me they've started a pretty strong direct-to-consumer beef business too, and I think COVID put jet fuel under that. So excited to hear about what they have to share. The Breitkreitz family are past Environmental Stewardship Award winners. We also have Jeremy McGill, who's a territory manager and regional product specialist with Gallagher Animal Management, and someone that I've gotten to know a little bit getting ready for this, and he's really passionate about grazing and what they can do to serve producers. So I know he'll bring a lot of solutions, but we're going to start off tonight with Dr. Chris Teutsch from Kentucky. He's Extension Associate Professor and Forage Specialist at the University of Kentucky. He also, if you can't get enough of him tonight, you can look him up online, do a little Google search, and find a lot of his materials recorded out there if you want to take a deeper dive on Eastern or Kentucky forages. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Teutsch now.
All right, Josh, can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. And first, I'd like to thank Josh and the NCBA for inviting me to come talk to you tonight a little bit about forage plant growth and grazing management. And this is going to seem like a little bit of a memory trip back into biology class for a lot of you, but understanding the basics of forage plant growth is really critical to understanding how to manage plants under grazing. So again, I'm Chris Teutsch, Forage Extension Specialist at the University of Kentucky Research and Education Center located in Princeton, Kentucky. And as Josh alluded to, if you're interested in more videos on all aspects of forage and grazing management, you can go to our KY Forages YouTube channel. All right, I always like to start off with this table, and this is adapted from Southern Forages. Basically, it shows us different forage species in the first column, and then it shows us when we should start grazing, when we should stop grazing, and how many days we should rest. And this is a great tool, but really, if you don't have a basic understanding of forage plant growth, these numbers mean very little to you. And my goal tonight is when we finish some of these, I hope that some of these numbers start to make sense to you as you look at this chart again. I'm going to cover a couple different topics tonight. And the first one is plant physiology. And that's just a fancy word for what's going on inside that plant, those vital processes. We'll talk a little bit about plant morphology, That's another fancy word for the physical structure or form of that plant. Does it grow prostrate or does it grow in a clump and upright? And then we'll talk about how these two things interact to determine how we should be managing that plant under grazing. Whenever we talk about plant physiology, I always like to start off with photosynthesis. This is the most important biochemical process on Earth. If it wasn't for photosynthesis, none of us would be on this webinar tonight. And this is the process by which light energy from the sun is converted into chemical energy by the plant. And this is the chemical formula for that. Carbon dioxide here from the air plus water from the soil is converted into sugars and carbohydrates in that plant. And a very important byproduct for us, of course, is oxygen. And this all happens in a specialized part of the plant cell called the chloroplast. And that's what gives the plant its green color. And this whole process is driven with light energy from the sun. There's two major photosynthetic pathways that we find in our grasses. The first one is a C3 pathway, and we find this in our cool season grasses. This particular photosynthetic pathway is very well adapted to carrying out photosynthesis at cooler temperatures. In fact, we have maximum photosynthesis in the leaf blade of a cool season grass around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's that mean in terms of practical considerations? It means we're going to have the most growth in the spring and the fall. And then during the summer months, when temperatures get warmer, growth is limited by high temperatures. Our C4 grasses, or our warm season grasses, evolved from our cool season grasses to get around this problem of poor production during the summer months. And they've done it very efficiently. They don't actually reach peak photosynthesis until around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So that means that they're very productive during the summer months, but not much going on in the spring or the fall. One of the things to remember about warm season grasses is that they're very efficient at using water. In fact, they'll produce about twice as much dry matter per unit of water used during the summer months compared with our cool season grasses. And the practical implication of that is that if you have the ability to irrigate some pastures, you definitely want to be irrigating a C4 or a warm season grass in the summer months because they're so much more efficient at converting that water into dry matter. We'll talk just a little bit about plant morphology. Remember, that's just a fancy word for the physical structure of that plant. When we look at our grasses, we have two classes of grasses. We have what we call our bunch grasses or clump grasses, and that would be something like tall fescue or orchard grass. They kind of grow in a clump. And a good sod of tall fescue will look like a solid sod, but really it's a lot of the clumps close together. As pastures start to thin or hayfields start to thin, you'll start to see this clumpy nature in these pastures, and that's the actual physical structure or morphology of that plant. They tend to have tillers that form clumps and kind of grow erect and upward. Our sod formers include things like Bermuda grass, which is C4 grass, and Kentucky bluegrass, a C3 grass. And they have structures called rhizomes and stolons. We'll talk more about those in a minute, but that allows those plants to spread out and kind of fill in and form a very dense sod. So why am I telling you this? The reason I'm telling you this is just because when you look at a grass, you can tell a little bit about how it should be managed under grazing just by looking at it. If it's erect, kind of a bunch type grass, it's going to be less tolerant to close grazing. So that means you're going to have a little bit higher grazing height. If it's a prostrate grass like Bermuda grass, we can graze it very tightly because it's closer to the soil. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on tonight. Some other structures of grasses and legumes that I like to just mention is the root system. When we look at a legume, and a good example would be alfalfa, we have often a taproot system. That's one single root that goes down that has some branches off of it. And this is very effective at going deeper into the soil, which makes a plant like alfalfa very drought tolerant because it's able to find water when other plants are not able to find water. Grasses have a fibrous root system, and our commonly used grasses in the eastern United States, like orchard grass or tall fescue, will have about 90% of their roots in the upper 10 inches of soil. So they're very effective at capturing moisture and nutrients applied to the soil surface. What they're not so effective at is persisting through drought or growing through drought, because most of the root system is in that upper 10 inches of soil. The other two structures I want to mention are rhizomes and stolons. We had mentioned them on the previous slide. These are modified stems that grow along the soil surface or just under the soil surface. A rhizome will grow just under the soil surface. A stolon will grow just above the soil surface. They both store carbohydrates, and they both allow that plant to spread out. So if we have a sod that's damaged, if we have a stoloniferous or a rhizotomous plant, they can actually fill that sod back in, where a bunch grass cannot do that. A good example of a rhizome here is Johnson grass. Commonly, we think of it as a weed, but it actually can be a pretty good forage crop if it's properly managed. A good example of a stolon would be white clover. And if you ever notice in a pasture, white clover will actually fill in between clumps of grass in that pasture because it can spread out and fill in. Bermuda grass has both stolons and rhizomes. All right, so we have a defoliation event taking place here. And the question is if we've got adequate moisture and we've got adequate fertility in that soil, what do we need for regrowth? And the answer is energy. Just like we need to turn on our lights or drive our car, that plant needs energy to regrow. And that energy comes to that plant through photosynthesis and through stored carbohydrates. So where does that energy come from? It comes from leaf area remaining after grazing. So when we manage grazing in a pasture, what we're doing is we're leaving some leaf area in that pasture. And that leaf area is like a solar panel. The more leaf area we leave, the faster that pasture is going to regrow. If we graze that pasture very tightly, we're removing the ability of that plant to capture sunlight. The second place is from stored carbohydrates in that plant. So that's that product of photosynthesis. And it's stored up in the plant so that the plant can use it after stressful events like defoliation or grazing, or it goes through a drought, or it goes through winter. If it's got good carbohydrate stores, it's going to have energy so that that plant can regrow after that stressful event. Now, different plants store their carbohydrates in different places. And you're asking, why is he bothering to show me this? And the answer is because it's going to impact how you manage that plant under grazing. So, for example, if we take orchard grass, a cool season bunch type grass, it's going to store it in the stem base. So what's that mean in terms of practical implications? What that means is that if I graze an orchard grass pasture or mow it for hay and I cut it real close, I do two things to that plant. I remove its ability to capture sunlight because I cut all of its leaves off, right? And the second thing I do is I get down into the stem base where it's storing its stored energy. So what I'm essentially doing is putting the double whammy on that plant. We're not going to kill it by grazing close one time or cutting close one time, but when we do it repeatedly, that really hurts orchard grass stand. The other example I like to use is Bermuda grass. And Bermuda grass, remember, has those structures called stolons and rhizomes, those modified stems. And that's where they store their carbohydrates at. So they're safely below the grazing height of the animal, along or right below the soil surface. So even if I do graze that pasture tightly, I'm not taking away any of this carbohydrate reserves. Plus, Bermuda grass has quite a bit of leaf area close to the soil surface. So it's pretty tolerant of close and frequent grazing compared to orchard grass. One thing that I like to talk about when we talk about forage plant growth is carbohydrate cycling. And I like to use alfalfa as an example. Alfalfa is 100% dependent upon stored carbohydrates for regrowth. So what happens when we graze or defoliate an alfalfa pasture or hayfield is that the plants start to regrow. And if you've ever looked at an alfalfa field after mowing or grazing, there's not much left there but stems. So the energy is coming from somewhere. In alfalfa, it comes from stored carbohydrates in the taproot of the plant. So as that plant starts to regrow, and alfalfa regrows very rapidly after defoliation, The non-structural carbohydrate concentration in the roots, which is represented by this line on the bottom, declines very rapidly. And all of a sudden it starts to grow up when that plant reaches about 6 to 8 inches tall. So what's happening at that point? What's happening is that the alfalfa plant has regained its leaf area or solar panel, and it's capturing enough sunlight and converting it into sugars and carbohydrates is able to fuel its own regrowth now from photosynthesis, plus the extra gets shifted back into storage in the plant. And by the time we're ready to cut or graze alfalfa again in approximately 30 days after defoliation, we're back up to pre-cut levels. This is what we call the carbohydrate cycle. All forage plants have a carbohydrate cycle, but it's probably most pronounced in alfalfa. What would happen if we allowed this plant to grow to 6 to 8 inches tall and then we mowed it or grazed it off again? Well, we would draw the carbohydrates slower. And if we do this repeatedly, like happens in a continuously stocked pasture, then we start to see slower and slower and slower regrowth, and plants become weaker, and eventually they will die. It won't happen if you do it one time, but when you do it repeatedly, like in a continuously stocked pasture, that's when pastures become weak. And as plants get weaker and less vigorous, it leaves space between the plants, and in that space grows weeds. So we see weeds start to come into the pasture as the pastures start to get thinner. I really like this diagram. This is from an old publication from 1986 by Dr. Blazer and colleagues. And this is actually, this publication is available online from the library at Virginia Tech. If you're interested in grazing management, I would highly recommend getting it. Dr. Blazer was way ahead of his time. This diagram is from this publication, and what it shows is a tiller of grass here. And this happens to be tall fescue tiller. And what Dr. Blazer says is once this structure called the collar shows, this leaf, if it's cut off, it's not going to regrow. So what does that? What should we do with that leaf blade? Should we graze it off, or should we keep it? And before you think about answering that, take a look at a real tall fescue tiller that I just took a picture of this afternoon. So there's the structure of the collar. Once that collar shows on this tall fescue tiller, this leaf blade is not going to regrow. So if I graze this off, this blade is not going to grow anymore. So the question is should I leave some of this blade or should I graze it all the way off? What I want you to notice is that this blade is green. So green means photosynthesis. So it's still photosynthesizing, but if it's not expanding and growing, where are those sugars and carbohydrates going? They're going back down into the plant to fuel regrowth of this new leaf coming out. So the answer is that we really need to stop, and we need to leave some leaf area in our pastures. And when we leave that leaf area, even though this blade may not be regrowing, it is going to fuel growth of this new leaves coming out of this tall fescue tiller. This is kind of a complex diagram, but I think it really gets this idea of interactions between carbohydrates and leaf area across. And if you look at one diagram, go back and look at one diagram in this presentation, look at this again. If you understand this diagram, you understand the whole premise of rotational stocking. So I divided this diagram in half. And on the left-hand side of the diagram, we'll see pastures that have a high carbohydrate status. So what's that mean? That means they were rested between grazing events and allowed to recharge their carbohydrates. And this would be synonymous with rotationally grazed pastures where we graze and rest and allow it to rebuild its leaf area and recharge its carbohydrates. On the right half of this diagram, we have plants with a low carbohydrate status. So this is what we would find in a continuously stocked pasture. So every time this little tall fescue plant starts to grow, it's grazed off by the animal in this continuously stocked pasture. So it never has a chance to build those carbohydrates back up. And then Dr. Blazer did two other things. He either left 2 inches of leaf area or he clipped the leaf area all the way off. And then he measured regrowth. And what he found was the regrowth was 1 inch on the plants that had 2 inches of leaf area left in a high carbohydrate status, and it formed 4 new tillers at the bottom, versus less than half as much regrowth with plants that had a low carbohydrate status and no leaf area left. And they formed less than half as many tillers, so this stand is thinning due to continuous stalking. The point that I want to make here is that we're managing 2 things with rotational stalking. We're managing the carbohydrate status and we're managing the leaf area. When we manage those 2 things, we can increase pasture productivity about 30%. We always talk about what happens to the top of the plant, and we don't spend enough time talking about what's going on underneath the ground. And this is a really nice root growth stoppage study that was done at the USDA in the 1950s. Just because it's old doesn't mean it's bad data. It's really good data and gets some important points across. So what they found was that if they removed 50% of the shoots, so if I had 10 inches of grass and I removed 5 inches of that grass with grazing or defoliation, we stopped the root growth temporarily. If I removed 90% of that shoot material, so if I had 10 inches and I removed 9, we stopped the root growth for 17 days. If they clipped these plants 3 times a week, root growth never resumed. And if they took 40% or less of the top of the plant or the shoots, root growth didn't stop. So the practical implications of this is that what we do to the top of the plant impacts what's below the ground. And if you look at this diagram, this would be an example of a continuously stalked pasture. So every time that plant grew a little bit, we grazed the top of the plant off. So the root system in that continuously stalked pasture is going to be smaller. This is in the middle is a rotationally stalked pasture. Just by how we're managing that grazing, we're not only impacting the top of the plant, but we're impacting what's below the ground. And that's really, really important to understand, because one of the benefits of rotational stalking that we don't talk enough about is that pastures that are rotationally stalked grow longer into droughts and come out of droughts faster because they have a positive carbohydrate status and they have a stronger root system. I'm going to kind of finish this section up with this diagram. This is one of my favorite diagrams, and it really relates morphology and physiology in relation to grazing management. So if we look at orchard grass, which is the second plant here, and this is a pretty close grazing height, 1 3/4 inches or so, and we look at what's left underneath this dotted line, what we see is that it's pretty much just stem base left here. So we're removing all the orchard grass leaf area, so we're removing its ability to capture sunlight, right? And then we're starting to get down into the stem base with this close grazing height. So what's that tell us? That tells us that orchard grass is not going to do real well under this close management, especially if it's frequent grazing. It's just not going to be as productive underneath that type of management. Does that mean we can't use orchard grass in grazing systems? Absolutely not. It just means we need to manage it a little bit different. If we compare that to Bermuda grass underneath this close grazing height, remember Bermuda grass stores its carbohydrates in the stolons and the rhizomes. So that's these structures right here along and right below the soil surface. So that stored energy is safely below the grazing height of the animal. Plus, it's got quite a bit of leaf area close to the soil surface, below that 1 3/4 inches. So Bermuda grass is going to do really well under close and frequent grazing compared to something like orchard grass. If you understand those basic principles, then you understand how to manage different plant types under rotational stalking. Just wanted to finish up and talk a little bit about getting started with rotational stalking. And the first thing I always like to mention is that you've got to have a good attitude going into it. Look, if you don't do it because I tell you to do it, or Jeremy does, or Grant tells you to do it because you want to do it. If you go into this and say, well, this is never going to work, chances of you being successful are pretty slim. In controlled grazing systems, water is key. And we've got to have a water source if we're going to rotationally stock pastures. So it's very critical that we think about how we lay that water source out when we start. And again, we're managing 2 things. We're managing how close those animals are grazing that pasture and how long gets rested between grazing events. And by managing those two things, we're going to increase productivity of those pastures by about 30%, and we're going to improve drought tolerance of those pastures because we're going to have a stronger and healthier root system. The other thing that we don't talk enough about with rotational stocking is that we improve nutrient cycling within grazing systems. So we have improved distribution of dung and urine within a pasture. The smaller we make the pastures, the better distribution pattern that we'll have for dung and urine. Still not perfect, but much better than a continuously stocked pasture. The other thing that we are not going to talk about tonight, but there's a nice video on our YouTube page, is about managing botanical composition. So how we graze pastures, how close and how frequently can have a dramatic effect on what plants are dominant within that sward. And we can use rotational stocking to manage how much clover or how much grass proportion we have in the pasture. It's really a tremendously powerful tool. I just want to mention that the intensity of the rotational stocking system depends on your wants and needs. And that's really important to realize. A lot of people see presentations where people are removing animals twice a day, and it really turns them off, and they're saying, there's no way I can do that. You don't have to do that to implement a rotational stocking system. If you want to move your animals once a week on Sundays after church, then you set your system up to do that. And that's going to be much better than letting them continuously graze. And it's important to build flexibility into your rotational stocking system when you set it up. And Jeremy will talk more about some of the products that they have that will allow you to do this. But the more flexibility you can build in, it's going to allow you to grow as your grazing management improves over time. And that's especially important for your watering system. A lot of thought needs to go into the watering and fencing systems for rotationally stocking. I just wanted to show you this, and I guess it kind of shows what a slow learner I am. It says after almost 2 decades of attending and teaching grazing schools, it finally dawned on me, we make implementing rotational stocking too hard. And I think there's a lot of truth in this. We talk too much about very intensive systems. In reality, you know, if we want to implement a rotational stocking system on most farms, all we need to do is close some gates and allow some pastures to rest. And we have a rudimentary rotational stocking system. The other thing that I think it's important to realize is that you need some base level of soil fertility. It's hard to make something out of nothing. So if you have real low soil fertility and a real low pH, you need to think about amending that soil so that we get up. You don't have to be in the high range, but I'd like to see you be in the medium or medium plus range for phosphorus and potassium. I'd like to see your pH be between 6 and 6.4 to help encourage legumes in that pasture. Last thing I want to mention is stocking rate. And one of the things that rotational grazing can't overcome is if you're stocked too high. If you're stocked too high, you're going to have both low animal performance and poor pasture production. And there's just not a lot you can do about it other than feed supplemental feeds. If you're too low, you can actually lose money, right? Because you're not utilizing your forage sources optimally. So what's the optimum? And it's going to really depend on where you're at in the country. If you're in the arid part of the country, you're going to have a much larger number of acres per cow-calf unit. Here in the humid east, you know, we can bounce around somewhere between 2 to 3 acres per cow-calf unit in well-managed pastures. So in closing, I just want to say that understanding forage plant growth allows for the maintenance of a healthy and vigorous sod, and that healthy and vigorous sod is going to be good for both the animal and the environment. And here's that chart that we started with, and hopefully some of these numbers are going to start to make a little bit more sense to you after listening to this presentation tonight. And we're going to save our questions to the end of the meeting tonight. So make sure and type them into the chat room. And I'm going to turn it over to Grant now.
All right, thank you, Chris. Putting this together today, I got the privilege to watch Chris's presentation first, and I thought I was going to name this Grazing Your Way to Soil Health because that's the way we finally got to looking at it on our operation, and I'll show you how we got there. Okay, all right, there we go. I got it to go. So Don and I got started here in Southwest Minnesota in 1997. We bought out my parents. We had 58 head of cow-calf operation here. And all I knew from my father and my grandfather was set stock grazing. And we'd graze about 3.5 months, and then we'd be feeding cattle. And it finally hit us, why don't we have enough? Why can't we produce enough to get way longer than 3.5 months? So I started studying grazing management, and we kind of set our goals is to increase our cow herd and obviously to provide additional feed so we could graze longer, didn't have to put up so much stored feed. So we started out kind of simple with an EQIP contract. And Chris mentioned this, that it's important to plan things out. We started here with an EQIP contract because of the cost share. And if you look close at this picture, you can see there's some thistles in the back yet. You can see our grass is growing pretty good height here in the front. And that was the start of it. And we realized right away, as soon as we started moving these cattle around on 3 to 5 day rotations, that our productivity just about doubled on these. Before we put in all the fences and did all this, we were fertilizing and spraying herbicide every year. And we always had what we called the Great August and September Christmas tree cutting, when we were out there cutting bull thistles off that had made it through the resin or through the spray. And it was just no fun doing this. So we went through all the different terminologies that are out there, from meg grazing, mob grazing, all the different terms that are out there. We tried them all to our best of our knowledge of the systems the way we knew them. You can see here, this is the same pasture. We've made great improvements here. We're moving the cows now on what we were calling at the time mob grazing. We did not seed anything into this pasture. We had experts out here and looked at it, and we converted this pasture from 3 species to over 30 species. As we did this, and as we set up the rotational grazing, we immediately stopped fertilizing and herbicide applications. Was that the right decision? Not really sure, but eventually we got grass to grow like this. This is that same pasture any given year now. We went from only being able to graze or raise grass forage that would be boot high to now there's pastures that we've got that we've worked on this intensively with for years and years and years, and you can't see the cattle when you move them now. We kind of like to call it managed adaptive grazing now, just because we learned when we were stuck in a system, or what Dawn and I thought was a system, we found problems, and we realized that we had to learn to adapt and move quicker, slower, timing, and those types of things. So what we do in our operation is basically we try to mimic nature. And if you look back in history, you know, before humans got here and settled, the bison, the elk, the huge herds that we all heard about in history moved. And they were pushed by predators, they were pushed by weather, whatever, but they were in huge, huge groups to stay away from the predators, to protect themselves from predators. In doing this, they put down massive amounts of carbon or massive amounts of forages as they were running and moving. They obviously only took a little bit off the top as they were moving, and they had extremely long rest periods in their movements across North America. So we try to mimic that. This is what we look like after 1 day graze. Chris made the very scientific approach to it about how important the leaf area is. You can still see we have leaf area here. We have the ability to collect and make photosynthesis work here. At the same time, I mentioned before that we stopped fertility and herbicide. This is now our fertility and herbicide program. We've trampled a lot of material to the soil. As Chris mentioned, we've distributed the manure and the urine. And we've also put a great cover on top of the soil so that no weeds can emerge if our plant density isn't thick enough. Once again, we're trying to do what nature did before we were here. I will mention that this has taken us some time to get to this because we cut out all the synthetics immediately. I firmly believe maybe we should have kept fertilizing a little bit. It would have helped us along this path, but we've been down this road 12 years now or better without any fertility or herbicide application. As Chris mentioned, you need to start with the water. Water is the key to making any of this work. We have put in, I believe, 29 tanks, and in starting out with Equip, it's what we did because there was cost share there. It cheapened up the out-of-pocket expense for installing water facilities. And it's something, like Chris said, needs to be planned out. So by doing all this and the way we do the managed intensive grazing, we've been able to change our operation drastically. This is some pretty rough ground in our river valley here. When we took this pasture over, these hilltops wouldn't even grow forage. Now we're getting actual grazable forage on these native rough pastures. And we've got a tremendous amount of seed bank coming back because of the rest and recovery period. The latent seed bank is there. As a younger man, I did not believe the latent seed bank. I thought it was almost voodoo-ish that could possibly be there after so many herbicide treatments, or even on some of our improved pastures here where we seeded cropland back. I didn't think there could possibly be a latent seed bank there, but it is there. And if you give it the right management, it will come back. In saying that, that leads right into this picture. Chris mentioned alfalfa. This was a farm field that we struggled to ever get production off of. We'd collect crop insurance 6 out of 10 years on this because it's very sandy, very light soil on the river bluff, as you can see here. And we seeded it just to alfalfa. We thought if we got 2 or sometimes 3 cuttings a year, that would be our income for the year. Off of it, we get some winter feed put up. And as I learned grazing and grazing management, I learned that we had to watch for the species that we wanted to be out there. So instead of watching the cows graze the alfalfa, we watched the grasses that were coming up in between the alfalfa as it was getting weaker and dying off, and managed the cattle so we did not hurt those grasses that were coming through. So we'd take 20 to 30, maybe 40% of that grass off and get the cows out and give it a good rest period. And this is what we did with no added seed. This all came out of latent seed bank. Obviously in this picture, it looks like there's a lot of brome here, which there is, but there are a lot of clovers. There are a lot of other grasses in this right now. This, by doing planned, adaptive, managed grazing on this has now become one of the most productive pieces of land on our farm, just by using the cows and watching the grasses and the species that we're trying to manage. Chris mentioned this can't be drudgery. This can't be, oh, I got to go move cows 2 times a day. I got to go move cows 3 times a day, 4 times a day to make this work. This has got to be something, as he mentioned, that is your idea, your passion, and you want to improve things. Over the years, Dawn and I did things on the cheap and struggled, and it got to the point where, oh, great, we got to go out, roll up another polywire, we got to walk another polywire out. So finally, we just took some time and built this on the back of our side-by-side. You know, we got enough posts on here, I believe, to build about 1.5 miles of fence. We can obviously stick more spools on here. We've got everything we need right with us, and we make it go quick and easy. So it's not something that's dreaded every day. Simple things like this. This is just to spool wire out. As I'm getting older, I'm getting lazy. I prefer to sit in my Kubota, listen to the radio, watch the cows out the front of the Kubota and the wildlife, and just sit in there. I'll grab a bundle of posts off the back, put them in the front with me. I'll string my wire out, put it all up as I'm driving along. Yeah, the posts aren't all spaced perfectly, but you do this enough times, you figure it out quick and make it easy. The water situation, like I said, originally we started out with equip and we put in tanks. This was a new piece of ground that we picked up, and Dawn and I, after 15 years of doing this, realized we did not want to put in permanent tanks. We knew that we could improve the diversity, the productivity of the pastures if we could move the water source. Because what happens when you move cattle, you get a hot summer day, anything like that, they kind of gather around water. If you look at manure distribution around water, it's heaviest from the water and moves out. And we thought if we could move water, this would really help to improve things. So this was not an equip contract or any cost sharing of any sort. I just put my mind to it. I'm going to build something. I'm going to prototype something and try it out. So this is the way it looks when we're moving, and we do it all in one pass. Dawn usually does this by herself. She's moving 200 plus yearlings at a time here. She's got all her posts. She's got all of her spools. She's got her water. She's got her mineral feeder. There's a brush on here because there is no trees in this pasture at all. We found that to be very important to keep our water sources clean. Managed intensive grazing. Obviously, we're up in Minnesota and we graze cover crops, but it's important whenever you're grazing to manage your grazing system. Just to quickly overview what we do here, what we've learned over the years is we alter our stock densities. We never move through our rotation the same. We alter the grazing heights, as was mentioned before. We alter our rest periods. And all of us with livestock know at some point in time, Mother Nature or some other deal, if we just got too many cattle or whatever, we're going to overgraze a paddock. And we do that here. We still do this day, but this is a disruption. Mother Nature likes disruptions. It's just don't do it to the same place multiple times. As Chris showed you, you'll destroy roots. You'll destroy the ability of the plants to heal and move on. I guess the biggest thing that we've learned going through this is we're working with nature, with the cattle, with grasses, with rainfall, with everything. And nature is self-regulating, self-healing, and self-organizing. But we, as the producers and the managers of livestock, have to do proper management to make it all function. And it comes down to basically the principles of soil health, keeping the soil covered. That's our trample. That keeps the weed pressures down. It's the fertility. It's the herbicide. Minimize the disturbance to the soils. We had no idea the latent seed bank would come back after we stopped adding synthetics to our system. Increase the crop diversity. That came on its own by proper management. Living roots in the soil. We have grass green up as snow melts now. We never used to see that. And obviously, the livestock is the key to it. But it comes down to the last point here is context. Everybody that's watching this needs to do it at their own time, their own place, their own comfort level. It's context, whatever you're comfortable with and what you want to move on and do. And in saying this all comes back to soil health. We've done massive amounts of testing here on our farm and ranching operation. We have increased our water infiltration rates to 8 to 15 inches per hour at a time. I'm in a major row cropping country, so our cattle are downstream from the row crops. We're trying to hold all our water on our land, and as Chris said, we have the regrowth. We rebound faster in a drought. But the biggest thing is the environmental side of it. You know, there's a reason people are getting mad at us as producers. Maybe if we all improve our grazing management, we can get some more water to stay in the soil and we don't wash this massive amount of silt down to Lake Pepin or to the Gulf. This is what really helped us a lot is if you want to make small changes, change how you do things. But if you want to make major changes, change how you see things. We used to chase production. Now we look at profit per acre. And that really changed how our operation functions. You know, Ian Mitchell-Ennis told me this a long time ago, if you build it, they will come. The wildlife that's come back to our operation is very good, and it's very destructive at the same time, but it's also allowed us to open up hunting opportunities again and charge for it. And the biggest thing is from the Bible. It says, ask the animals and they will teach you. Ask the birds of the sky and they will tell you. Speak to the earth and it will instruct you. This all comes back to observation. When Dawn and I started out, all we did was kick the cows out. We never really observed what was happening in nature. Now we spend a lot of time out there looking at species, looking at how much the cattle are taking off of each plant. It's about observation. So with that, thank you, and I will turn it over to Jeremy.
Right. What a great segue into the power fencing portion. So I enjoyed that, Grant, and excellent to see a few tools of the trade in your slides. So I'm just going to take a few minutes this evening and go over a few power fence solutions that we offer you at Gallagher that can assist you in a managed grazing operation. And I'm Jeremy McGill with Gallagher, and I'm a territory manager. And I'm just going to give you a view from about 30,000 feet and then highlight a few tools along the way. So when we're talking about power fencing or electric fencing, we have to keep in mind that it is a psychological barrier. And what we've learned from a psychological barrier is they are extremely, extremely effective. As a matter of fact, psychological barriers that are produced by electric fence or power fence are so effective that we use them all across North America to control these types of animals in most every zoo and animal theme park that you can imagine. And in a lot of cases, the electric fence is the primary barrier that keeps the animals off of the structural fences. So we know it works if it's built correct. Now, if we can control these animals, is there any reason why we cannot control these animals? And if you look at these two photos, this is what's possible when you're using a very effective portable electric fence system for managed grazing. And we'll get a little bit deeper into that. But first thing that you need to ask yourself is, who is making the decisions on your farm? Who controls the dynamics? Is it you, or is it your livestock? And if your answer is your livestock that's making the decisions, then we've got a few solutions for you. And so it's really simple. And there's not a lot that's required to change the dynamics. As a matter of fact, you really only need three things in the most basic form just to get started with some type of managed grazing. That's an energizer, a fence charger, some temporary posts, and the portable wire itself. So is it really that simple? I'll assure you it is. And from a Gallagher standpoint, we've got over 85 years in animal management and developing and engineering some of the best products available. At this point, we're at over 100 research and development team members. And so we try to take the hard part out of it to make your life easier. So our products go through a rigorous testing program. There's a lot of just little subtle additions that we add to our products that you don't really think about until you get ready to use them. So temporary fencing for managed grazing is a low-tech concept, but there's a lot of technology built into the research and development side of it. So it's no secret that as farmers and ranchers and cattle producers that we do like to take some shortcuts, and I'll be the first to admit it. And what we see across North America and globally are three pretty well consistent trends when talking about power fencing where problems occur. The most problem to fix normally, and the most common, is improper grounding. We also see a lot of cases where the user just doesn't have enough power. They don't have a big enough energizer for the system that they're trying to. And also, another common mistake is using the wrong type of wire for the wrong application. So you can use the top of the line equipment, but it still requires a little bit of attention on your part to make sure you're doing things right. So the ground system, this is absolutely the most overlooked part of the system. And this is where most failures occur. So the recommendation, it's not just Gallagher's recommendation, but it's also the recommendation of most every cooperative extension service in the U.S., as well as the NRCS. The recommendation is 3 ground rods, 10 feet apart, 6 feet deep, continuous wire that connects them all together. Now, one thing to keep in mind is we don't want to mix metals. So we know that 2 dissimilar metals will corrode if you run electricity through them. So with that in mind, we never want to join copper and galvanized together. If you join copper and galvanized, you will get electrolysis, you will get corrosion, and it's going to be harder to conduct energy because your ground system does conduct energy. Think of your ground system like a magnet. The bigger the magnet you have, the more power you can pull through. So when an animal touches the fence, we want to pull the fence down through that animal's body, back through the soil to the energizer and complete the circuit. So next up, selecting the right power level, selecting the right energizer. And what are we trying to achieve with this to make sure we have the right size power? Well, obviously savings and definitely peace of mind. I don't want to constantly be worrying about my managed grazing system and a fence failure. So choose the energizer up front that will pull the greatest load that your operation is going to require. So always select a larger energizer than what you think you need. For example, we don't want to choose an energizer that's just going to get us by in the wintertime when there's no grass load, and then expect it to perform the same way in the summertime or the spring once the grass and weed flush occurs. So when we're talking about power, then we rate that in joules. And joules is very similar to horsepower on a vehicle. And the amount of power, the amount of joules that we need is dependent upon the distance of fence, the type of animal we're controlling, and the amount of interference on the system. So always get more than, think of it as an insurance policy of sorts. So when we think about wire selection, there's a few key components to keep in mind. Conductor, visibility, and portability. And is there a happy medium, and do we have to make some adjustments along the way depending on the operation? Absolutely. We know that the gold standard in conductivity readily available for our industry is going to be high tensile wire, 12.5 gauge galvanized steel high tensile. It's the most conductive of what's available. However, high tensile wire is not very portable. Definitely more designed for permanent fencing and cross. So that leaves us with another option of poly type products. Now, we manufacture 2 different selections of poly wire. One is our turbo line regular poly wire. So with turbo wire, it is a very high conductive 9 mixed metal strands with UV stabilized polyfilament. Regular poly wire, which is pretty consistent across industries, is typically made of 6 strands of stainless steel. And we know that stainless steel is not very conductive at all. So if you put in perspective of an athlete, think about high tensile wire as being a marathon runner. It can go long distances, and it carries a lot of power. And if we are using wire for a transmission line or for an extension cord of sorts to get power distributed out to where we're doing our managed grazing, then high tensile is definitely the best option for a multi-strand cross fence or a single strand offset. Now, if we look at turbo wire, that's more akin to a recreational runner. So it has decent endurance and it's a steady performer. We can go several miles with turbo wire or turbo braid. And then polywire, that's kind of like the rest of us. I can sprint, but so polywire, typically the recommendation is 1,000 foot or less because of the resistance. So keep that in mind and select the product that you think you're going to need in the future. So if you plan on expanding your system, then definitely look at the more premium and more conductive and portable products. Visibility, can't leave that out. There's one color that most university experts agree on that cattle and wildlife can contrast, and that's white. They can contrast white better than any other because you can get polywire in multiple different colors, but white will contrast the best against a green grass background in the springtime or a stockpiled tall fescue background in Kentucky in the winter that's turned a dirty tinge of brown. If the wildlife can see it, they will respect it also. So in terms of temporary fencing, once we decide on the type of wire, then we have to consider posts. Now, there's multiple options in post. You see two different photos here on the screen. The set of posts on the left, these are a more traditional style of post. Both of these posts are over 15 years old. They are a completely poly post that is a multi-lug step in. Now you will notice a couple of differences. The post on the right is an open lug design. I never have to manipulate or pull or touch the tabs on this post to insert or remove the wire. And this is very important once these posts get some age on them. Given the fact that this is a UV stabilized post and I never have to manipulate these tabs because they're open lug, you can see this post is still fully functional. The other post, for example, this is not an open lug post. So I manually have to manipulate this clip to insert and remove polywire out of this every time that I move the fence. And over time, a poorly UV stabilized post, you can see here what happens. And you start breaking the lugs off and you eventually wind up with a tomato steak, I guess, at the end of a few years. So if you're going to use a multi-lugged poly post, then definitely look at an open lug design like this heavy duty tread-in that has some superior UV stabilization in it. Now, the superior option to that, in my opinion, is going to be a steel shafted post. And the photo on the right, you see three different steel shafted posts. The left side is going to be a traditional pigtail post that was a great option for long use and also had quite good. The one drawback that we saw over time with the pigtail post is that using a turbo wire or a poly wire, you would get a lot of friction on the pigtail part of this. Well, inside of this poly coating is your metal shaft. So you could eventually wind up with a short on your fence and not know it for a while. So our engineers at Gallagher started working with some new materials a few years ago and glass-filled nylon. And we redesigned what we thought was possible and came up with the ring top design post. So you can see here, the shaft stops about 2/3 of the way up the insulating part, and there's no metal within the ring top portion of the post. Also, since we're using glass-filled nylon, then there's essentially no way to short out the fence using this design. And if you go back and look at some of Grant's photos, you see he's got several of these hanging on his side-by-side. And another option for fencing for post is the Gallagher tumble wheel. Now, and I'm sure Grant has heard this talking to some of his peers, and I know Dr. Toich has heard this time and time again, that a lot of potential grazers, they like to use the excuse of, well, I just don't have enough time. It just takes too much time to go out there and move fence and post, and it just takes too much time. Well, about 35 years ago, Gallagher started producing a product called a tumble wheel. This is an example of technology that can provide you with maximum time efficiency. This device is the fence post. The fence post literally rolls across the field or tumbles across the field, and moving fence is as easy as going to one end of the field or the other and pulling tension on the wire, walking down the side of the field, and the post tumble. If you want to learn more about these, then there's some videos on our official Gallagher YouTube page as well as our website. But just one extra tool for the serious rotational or managed grazer that does have a priority of time management. And also these tumble wheels, as you'll see in this picture, they work great for stockpiled forages. And in the Southeast, we are fortunate that we can manage tall fescue in the wintertime very easily by stockpiling it, and we don't have to worry about a back fence. So instead of putting out a bale of hay every day, then in this example, this producer can just move this set of tumble wheels every day instead. So another small tool that can make life much easier when carrying out a managed grazing system is a reel. Now, reel designs vary from simple to advanced. And if you will go back through, you will see this as well, this exact reel in some of Grant's slides. So you can be as simple as a spool and handle, or a more advanced design like this Gallagher geared reel we see here that is geared at a ratio of 3-to-1. So it makes it much quicker for retrieving your poly or turbo wire. Also, just a couple of added features that over time we've actually learned the necessity for this by talking to customers and cattle producers across the globe, such as a wire guide. This keeps your wire from flipping around the side of the spool. You'll notice this reel also has an insulated grip. And the most recent design, if you look in the second photo, is this latch. This latching system is made out of glass-filled nylon. This is designed where you can lock this reel either onto a fence and prevent it from being knocked off by nosy livestock or wildlife. Or if you go back and look at Grant's presentation, you'll see he's using these locks to latch these reels onto a side-by-side to transport across the field. So how do we achieve success with power fence? We've got to keep these simple concepts in mind. We have to make sure we've got a proper ground system, that we're choosing the right energizer for the job that we're actually trying to accomplish, and use the correct wire, post, and reels out of it. So we try to make it easy for you. We have the technology developed. We've got the research and development behind it. But if you want to, of course, you can make it difficult. And I will say, if you do take shortcuts, don't expect to get quality results 100% of the time. I don't think I really need to explain much in these two photographs. The one on the left is definitely not a reel, but it may suffice one time for a reel. And on the photograph on the right-hand side, I really don't think there are any instances where we should be using old garden hose, zip ties, and PVC pipe if we're expecting quality results on our operations. So here's the fun part. With our latest advances in technology and with the inclusion of the Internet of Things, we can offer solutions now that can connect your energizer to your fence system through multiple fence monitors located around your operation. that talk to a Wi-Fi gateway that then communicates with the cloud that is accessible from your smartphone in the world. So I can be anywhere with a phone signal. I can know exactly what's going on with my fence system. I can receive alerts, alarms, and I can turn my fence on and off from my smartphone. And it's all about being in control, making decisions, and also having the knowledge. And knowledge is power. So we try to offer you a comprehensive management solution that works for the entire operation. And with that, we think of permanent fence being the backbone of the system to distribute power out to the pastures, where you're actually utilizing some of the portable fencing that offers you some flexibility. Using a proper, well-built portable fencing system, this will allow for changes along the way. If you realize that something didn't work out so good this year, then change it next year. You heard Grant mention several examples of this. And then we tie it all together by monitoring performance. And if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. So consider monitoring your animal performance. There's been a lot of advances recently with EID, data collection, and scales and weighing. So we truly do believe that if you build your system right the first time, that's going to allow you to worry a lot less about your fence and your livestock in the long run, and you can focus on the things that matter. And in my case, I would much rather be focused on this little man sitting in pajamas on top of a Mirafiant waterer than I would be focused on worrying about my fence situation. So I'd be happy to answer questions. And with that, I will hand it over to Josh.
All right. Well, thanks to all of our presenters. That was really great. We're going to get to questions in just a second. I wanted to mention that we do have another webinar in this series coming up April 8th. So be sure and check back on the webinar series page. You can go there tonight if you want and go ahead and get signed up for that, or we'll obviously be posting the recording of this one up too. We have a lot of questions already in, so if our presenters will get ready. Grant, we have several questions for you wanting a little more specifics about your operation. How many cows you're running on how many acres in that rotational system, or do you have several different systems going on different places? Maybe just give us a little context there. And then I'll just let you stick with it and go straight to your portable watering system. Had several questions come in asking, be a little more specific about how that works. And again, if any of you want to go back and share your screens, let me know and I'll kick it back to you.
Okay, so originally Dawn and I started with the 58 cows here in the home farm. We've added a few acres of more pasture, and now we're running about 120 pair here. And instead of 3 months of grazing, 3.5 months of grazing, we're running 6+ months. Some of the pictures I had there on the new land that we had with Dawn and the side-by-side and the portable water tank, that's new land we've acquired. That's kind of our yearling operation where we develop yearling cattle out there. And on that one, when we set up the water system, there was already some divide fences in there. So what Dawn decided to do was, instead of putting portable tanks out there, let's build this, or the permanent tanks, let's build this portable tank. She actually did it the first year with a 100-gallon tank, watering 200+ head of cattle, which sounds impossible, but once you figure out the characteristics of the cattle, it can be done. But in that situation, you have to move the water first. So then I built the next portable tank on wheels, obviously, which had way more capacity, about 350 gallons capacity is all, which is enough. But in doing that, and as she made her first moves with the yearlings and kind of saw how many feet, how much distance, how much acreage was needed a day. She added in pop-up risers in the water lines we had on the permanent divide fences. So it ended up being about every 500 feet in this particular operation where she's got a pop-up riser. Now, when you're doing this, we highly recommend that you put up some kind of flag or something like that to find those risers back again, because we do have long rest and recovery periods, and when you're searching for water, it's just about impossible to find it. If we're going to change things, we can also go in there now and add more risers anywhere in that pipeline. It just gave us the ability to do so much. Eventually this year she got to the point where she's like, well, I want to move the water out farther into the paddocks instead of being along the divide fence. So we built a couple 250 or 300 foot long extension pipes that we just click into a riser, and it all clicks right into our portable water facility. So the distribution of the manure and the dung, as Chris mentioned, it's just unbelievable, the results we're seeing from that.
Great. I think that definitely helps answer that. And Dr. Toich, you've got a fan club out there. All the presenters we've had a lot of kudos coming in addition to the questions. It looks like Taylor Clark from Virginia says to tell you hello, Dr. Toich. We also had a couple of questions. Michaela and I wanted to know if that was a horse or a mule's nose in that one slide with a halter on it down close to the ground. Do you know?
Yeah, that was my wife's quarter horse. So she would take offense to calling it a mule.
Okay, well, don't tell her I said that. And then the other question we had some questions on, a little bit of questions on weeds, and Grant got into that a little bit, but could you just speak generally to, obviously it's going to be regionally different around, but if you're seeing a lot of weed pressure, and you want to stay away from the herbicides, maybe some strategies there, or is it any sort of indication on your fertility? Just a quick shout out on some basics on weed management.
I'll just mention real quick, several years ago here in Kentucky, we had a conference that focused on an integrated approach to weed control in pastures. And herbicides were part of that approach, but they were like the last option on this list of things that you can do. And in the first thing you need to ask yourself is, why do you have weeds in pastures? And people will often say, weeds are taking my pastures over, and really they're usually a symptom of another problem with your management. And a lot of times it can be related to soil fertility. You'll have poor soil fertility, which makes weeds that are better at competing in that low fertility environment more aggressive in your pastures. So soil fertility, making sure your soil fertility is where it needs to be, and then grazing management. I mean, if we're grazing our desirable pasture plants too hard, we're going to open that sod up and we're going to see weeds come into that sod. So those are two really important things to think about. If your weed control program is solely based on herbicide, it's going to be like a revolving door. You're going to go into a pasture, you're going to apply some herbicides, and believe me, there's some great herbicides out there, but you're going to kill the weeds that are there and you're going to leave a bare spot. Well, what grows in a bare spot? Well, weeds, right? So you're constantly applying herbicides, killing weeds, and never really kind of getting the full point. And the point is that you've got to manage those pastures in a way and introduce desirable plants into those open spots and manage them in a way that they're going to be persistent and competitive with the weeds in the pasture.
That took us a long time to figure out was the weed control part of it. I never believed that if you could put enough cover down on top of the soil, you would stop weeds. But as Chris just mentioned, if you look at a road construction project, what's the first thing that comes is weeds. Mother Nature does not like being naked. So she'll put whatever she can out there first. So if we overgraze pastures and we have gaps in our density of our forages that we want there, Mother Nature is naturally going to put a weed back in there. And it'll be a weed, a deep-rooted or shallow-rooted, whatever the soil is short of will be the first weed that gets put in there. So it just blew my mind that after I've been on this farm for over 50 years, and we used to spray, we used to chop weeds, and now we don't even consider it. We don't do it. And the one thing that I never thought we could get to is teaching our cows to eat weeds. Now, we don't call them weeds here anymore. We call them forbs. If you could teach a cow to eat it, it's a food source. So we call it a forb. And by using managed intensive grazing, adaptive grazing, we tightened up those cows and we taught them to eat those weeds. It only took a little bit of time to tighten up the cow herd and teach them that, hey, we only get one pass through this paddock, and then it's going to be followed by our neighbors and our other grazing ruminants here. So we get one chance through there to get what we want, and those cattle become less selective and they'll grab weeds. And after years and years and years with the same cow herd, the same genetics, the cows teach their daughters that we save as replacements, and we don't have to reteach the herd. They naturally do it from mothers teaching daughters back into the herd. It's just amazing how Mother Nature can function.
I think one of the artifacts from row cropping is that we think that there has to be no weeds in a pasture, and that's not true at all. And like Grant said, a lot of those weeds can actually be a fairly nutritious form. And weeds are not unlike forages. If we let them get mature in a pasture, they become less palatable, and animals will tend not to graze them as well. So staying on them and grazing when they're vegetative, they can actually be a fairly decent source of nutrition for livestock. Naturally, you don't want all weeds, right, in the pasture, but a few you shouldn't lose your mind over.
All right, Jeremy, bringing you in here, had several questions on that tumble wheel. Looks like you're sitting in the dark there. What kind of span can you run with those? That was one of the questions. It looked like that was a fairly moderately sized pasture. So really, what kind of distance can you put, between your anchor type posts and use those through the middle?
The typical recommendation is going to be 656 foot on a stretch. Somewhere between 60 and 90 feet between tumble wheels is more realistic. I have had several producers in East Tennessee that they'll run 1,000 foot to a quarter mile with tumble wheels. Now, you can't do that on a lot of undulating terrain. It has to be fairly flat. It works great in long creek bottoms or meadows. So typically then count on 656 feet to be a normal stretch.
Okay, that's great. And then another question, you really piqued a lot of interest with that mobile system that you showed for monitoring the fence and tying back into your phone. Can you give us, a ballpark for, say you're grazing 200 or 300 acres, maybe one main charger set up, big charger, and you can run everything off of that. What kind of money are we looking at a system that includes that app-based product?
That's a good question. And a lot of that's really going to depend on how much additional options that you put with the technology on the system. You can add up to 6 different fence monitors to that I-Series system. Right now, there are currently a whole lineup of I-Series, which are the energizers that are compatible with the technology, anywhere from an 18 joule all the way up to 100 joule, which is currently the largest one in the world at this time. So your mileage is going to vary and your cost is going to vary. Typically for somewhere around $1,000, that should get you started with monitors, iSeries, and remotes. And of course, that's going to depend on the size too. But that would be the starting budget would be right around $1,000.
Great. I think that gives folks a good idea of how they might could get started investigating anyway. And super. We've got a couple more questions here. Some of them are getting a little specific. So if your question hasn't been answered, we'll email those out to the specific presenter. Some of these are on specific weeds and different things. Why don't we just go down the line, everybody? Just a parting comment, or if you have a question for another presenter, we got just a few minutes, we can do that. We've still got about 100 folks on the line, so we really appreciate you guys sticking with us through more than an hour of presentation and through this Q&A. Chris, why don't we start with you? Either some closing comments, or if you have a question for somebody else, feel free to throw that in too.
Okay, I'll just say that one thing I want people to take away from tonight is that grazing management and rotational stocking is really a powerful tool for managing not just pastures and animals, but also soil improvement. And I think it's important to realize that from an infrastructure, for an infrastructure comment, I'll just say that one thing that I just will not do without anymore is a remote for energizers. I mean, that is just so handy. It's worth the extra $150 to get that remote and to get a charger that has that on it. It's so much better than having to go back to the barn to unplug an energizer or turn a switch off. And I'll turn it over to Grant.
Well, I would just highly encourage anybody that's not currently rotational grazing, whichever terms you want to use, get started. Productivity improves, the animal health improves, the issues that you're dealing with and fighting with right now will go away eventually. I will make the comment that grass is one of the slowest things that we've seen to improve and make better, but it does come with time. And I just highly encourage everybody to get started. And obviously, Jeremy and Chris both brought up the point of having high quality equipment. The remote, Chris, was one of the best investments we ever made. When you're a mile and a half, 2 miles from the charger and you find a problem, you just grab the remote, just like open and closing the garage door. It makes life very simple. And to us, it paid for itself in just months with saved time instead of going back to the barn.
Jeremy, jump on in there.
Well, I guess a final parting thought would be that we can make this easy for you if you let us. And I say we as a cumulative of not just Gallagher, but as your fellow peers in your area, like Grant, who is doing some type of managed grazing, and specialists like Dr. Teutsch. So between the products and the knowledge that's out there from the university and from the producer side, then there's no reason not to try it. And especially if you're in an area that I know in the Southeast, we have grazing schools and fencing schools on a regular basis. And I have to imagine that's fairly common across the country. But look into some of those hands-on educational type events and just get in and get your feet wet. But from a technology side, we can make it easy.
Well, great closing comments from all of our presenters. Thanks again, guys. It was very enjoyable. I always enjoy these and appreciate all the effort that you put into developing a great presentation, and look forward to more good presentations over the next month or so as we continue the series. We'll get the questions out if you didn't get yours answered and try to get back to you since I've got you guys' email that were participating. Y'all have a great night.